It was one of those days when the rain fell steadily, filling the air with a soothing hum that drowned out the usual city noise. I was half lost in my thoughts, lounging on the couch with a book, when a soft knock pulled me back to the present. Surprised, I set the book aside and made my way to the door, peeking through the peephole to see who could possibly be here. Standing there, casually leaning against the doorframe, was Caleb, Liam's younger brother. Caleb and I had crossed paths only a few times, mostly in passing during family gatherings and brief visits. He had a reputation for being the quieter one, mysterious even, and, though I had never given it much thought, I found myself unexpectedly aware of his presence now. Opening the door, I managed to smile. "Caleb, I wasn't expecting you." He returned the smile, his eyes briefly meeting mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. "Sorry for the surprise visit. Liam asked me to drop off some things he left at my place. Figured I'd swing by since I'm in town." "Come in," I said, stepping aside, feeling an odd flutter of anticipation as he walked in, the sound of rain a gentle backdrop to our quiet exchange. Inside, Caleb handed over a small box that he had been holding, glancing around my apartment as if taking everything in. "Nice place," he said, settling onto the couch across from me. "It suits you." "Thanks," I replied, unsure what else to say. I took the seat next to him, noting the subtle scent of his cologne that seemed to linger in the air. We fell into an easy rhythm of small talk, discussing the rain, Caleb's recent move to a new city, and the random chaos that came with it. I found myself watching him as he spoke, noticing little details that I hadn't before, how his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how his smile was a touch softer than I remembered. Despite the casual nature of our conversation, there was a subtle current in the air, something unspoken yet undeniable. "So, are you staying in town for long?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a few days," he replied, leaning back into the couch, his arm resting on the back in a relaxed but almost inviting manner. "Thought I'd spend some time with Liam, catch up with family, but honestly, I needed a break from everything." He paused, glancing at me with a slight smile as though debating whether to continue. "Things can get complicated." I nodded, sensing the weight in his words, though I didn't press further. There was a shared understanding that sometimes silence spoke more than words. As another quiet moment passed, I was acutely aware of how close we were sitting, closer than necessary, closer than I'd sat with anyone in a while. And as I looked over, I caught him watching me, his gaze unwavering, almost challenging me to acknowledge the tension. "So," he began, breaking the silence, "you and Liam have known each other for a while, right?" "Yeah, since college," I replied, feeling a little self-conscious. "He's like a brother to me." "And me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze still locked on mine. There was a faint, almost playful glint in his eyes, a look that sent a shiver down my spine. He leaned just a bit closer, his voice soft but intense. "What do you think of me?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. The air felt thicker, charged with a tension I couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened as I searched for a casual response, but nothing came to mind. Instead, I found myself looking back at him, drawn in by the warmth in his gaze, the quiet confidence in his smile. It was then that I realized my hand had somehow drifted closer to his, our fingers just a breath apart on the cushion. "I think," I began, my voice trailing off as I struggled to find the right words. "I think you're different. Not in a bad way," I added quickly, feeling my cheeks warm. "Just, you have this way of getting under people's skin." He raised an eyebrow, amusement flashing across his face. "Is that so?" he murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper. His hand shifted slightly, closing the small distance between us until his fingers brushed against mine, a simple touch that felt anything but innocent. My breath hitched, and I knew he could feel the tension radiating off me, could see the effect his presence had on me. "Yeah, I replied softly, my heart pounding. You surprise people. For a moment, we simply sat there, neither one of us pulling away. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, filling the silence between us. There was something in his gaze, something that made it impossible to look away. It was a vulnerability I hadn't expected, a glimpse of something deeper, and it stirred emotions I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. Caleb broke the silence first, his hand still resting lightly on mine. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't sure if I'd see you today. I thought maybe you wouldn't be here." "I'm glad you stopped by," I replied, almost surprised by the honesty in my own voice. His fingers moved slightly, brushing against mine with a gentleness that was both comforting and electrifying. It was as if every sense I had was heightened, each touch, each look magnified. Caleb's gaze softened, his smile fading as he studied me, his expression open yet unreadable. Slowly, almost cautiously, he leaned in, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and inviting, and my heart raced, caught between anticipation and the lingering hesitation in the pit of my stomach. "Is this okay?" he murmured, his voice laced with a vulnerability that took me by surprise. His eyes searched mine, waiting for some sign, some confirmation. Unable to trust my voice, I simply nodded, the world around us fading into the background as he closed the distance between us. His lips met mine in a soft, tentative kiss, a touch so gentle it felt almost dreamlike. There was a sweetness in it, a cautious exploration that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the warmth of his hand as it cupped my face, his thumb grazing my cheek in a way that felt both grounding and electrifying. The kiss deepened slowly, each movement unhurried, as if we had all the time in the world. I could feel the tension melting away, replaced by something softer, something I hadn't realized I'd been craving. His touch was careful, tender, as if he was savoring each moment, each second we shared. When we finally pulled back, both of us were breathing a little heavier, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and disbelief, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Caleb's hand lingered on my face, his thumb tracing gentle patterns along my jawline as he looked at me, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I didn't plan on that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did I replied, feeling my heart flutter at the openness in his gaze. We sat there in silence, each of us processing the moment, the quiet intimacy that had passed between us. But I knew that nothing could quite go back to how it was before. There was a new understanding, a quiet connection that hadn't been there before, and as we sat in the quiet of my apartment, I felt a warmth blooming in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. As the minutes ticked by, I became hyper-aware of everything, the warmth of his hand still resting against my cheek, the lingering softness of his breath as he spoke, and the slight flush that colored his cheeks. There was a fragile intimacy in the air, like we were sharing a secret neither of us had expected. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something deep and irreversible, and the realization sent a thrill through me that I couldn't deny. Caleb's gaze was unwavering, and I could tell he was searching my face, looking for any sign of doubt. His hand slipped from my face but stayed close, his fingers resting against my shoulder in a way that felt both grounding and charged. I didn't move, didn't pull back. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, feeling a sense of safety in his touch, a comfort that felt both unexpected and entirely natural. "So, what happens now?" I murmured, surprised at the honesty in my own voice. My words hung in the air between us, laden with the vulnerability I felt but couldn't quite express. Caleb's eyes softened, his hand squeezing my shoulder gently. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, but there was a warmth in his gaze that gave me hope, a promise of something beyond words. but I'd like to find out. With you." The simplicity of his answer left me speechless, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in ages. I knew that crossing this line, stepping into this uncharted territory, wasn't something either of us had planned. But as I looked into his eyes, all I could feel was a sense of belonging, as though this moment had been waiting for us all along. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain pattering softly against the window. There was no need for words, no rush to fill the quiet between us. The moment felt timeless, a gentle reprieve from the uncertainties that lay ahead. I found myself leaning into him, my head resting against his shoulder, feeling his arm come around me in an embrace that felt as natural as breathing. After a while, Caleb broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "You know, I've thought about this, about you, maybe more than I should have." His confession was simple, but it carried a weight that made my heart skip. I tilted my head to look at him, our faces just inches apart. "Really?" He nodded, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to mine, and I could see a faint vulnerability in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I never thought it would actually happen. But now that I'm here with you, I can't imagine feeling any other way." I felt my pulse quicken, the honesty in his words cutting straight to the heart of what I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. There had always been a part of me that noticed him, a quiet attraction I'd brushed off, convinced it was one-sided. But here we were, the reality of it so much more intense and grounding than I'd expected. Tentatively, I reached for his hand, our fingers intertwining naturally, as if we'd done this 1,000 times. "I don't know where this goes either," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm not afraid. Not with you." He smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and the sight made my heart swell with something I hadn't felt in a long time. As we sat there, hands clasped, sharing a connection I couldn't quite put into words, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where I was meant to be. Caleb's free hand reached up, his fingers tracing gentle patterns along my jaw, and the touch sent a shiver down my spine. He leaned in slowly, giving me a chance to pull back, but I didn't. I closed the distance, letting his touch and presence wash over me, grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and thrilling. As our lips met again, the kiss was slower, deeper, filled with a new sense of purpose. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty, an unspoken understanding that whatever happened next, we were both all in. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself sink into the moment, letting go of any lingering doubts or fears. Time seemed to blur, and for a while, there was only the quiet intimacy between us, the softness of his touch, the warmth of his skin. Everything else faded away. The rain, the room, the world outside. All that mattered was the quiet certainty of this moment, the feeling of being seen, of being accepted in a way I hadn't thought possible. When we finally pulled apart, we stayed close, foreheads resting together, our breaths mingling as we both caught our breath. I could feel the rapid beat of his heart against mine, a quiet reassurance that he felt this as deeply as I did. Caleb chuckled softly, his hand slipping from my neck but still resting on my shoulder. "You know, I didn't exactly plan on spending my day like this." I laughed, the sound feeling both strange and perfect in the quiet of the room. "Neither did I." I glanced at him, noting the way his expression had softened, a vulnerability lingering in his gaze. "But I'm glad you did." We stayed that way for a while, the silence between us filled with a sense of peace, of connection. I could feel his fingers tracing gentle patterns along my shoulder, a touch so tender it made my heart ache. There was an unspoken understanding in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the boundary we had crossed, the feelings we had finally allowed ourselves to embrace. As the rain outside began to let up, casting soft shadows across the room, I found myself wondering about the future, about what would happen next. There was so much we hadn't said, so much we hadn't figured out. But as I looked at him, his expression open and calm, I felt a strange sense of certainty, a feeling that no matter what came next, we would face it together. "Do you want to stay?" I asked, my voice soft, almost hesitant. Caleb's gaze met mine and he nodded, his smile filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart race. "Yeah," he replied, his voice a whisper. "I'd like that." He shifted closer, wrapping his arms around me in an embrace that felt as natural as breathing. And as we settled into the quiet together, I felt a peace wash over me, a warmth that went deeper than words. It was a feeling of acceptance, of belonging, and as I rested my head against his shoulder, I knew that this was the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. We stayed like that, wrapped in the warmth of each other's embrace, neither of us in a hurry to let the moment slip away. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the air cool and fresh, but inside, everything felt still and timeless. Caleb's fingers moved slowly along my back, a quiet rhythm that matched the steady beat of his heart against mine. I could feel his breathing, calm and even, grounding me in the reality of it all. I thought about what it meant, the way we'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone, how the simplicity of a visit on a rainy day had evolved into something that felt so profound, so necessary. The silence between us was comforting, filled with a shared understanding that there was no need to rush, no need to fill the space with unnecessary words. Eventually, Caleb shifted, pulling back slightly to look at me, his gaze soft but intense. "I don't think I can pretend that this didn't happen," he said, his voice low but firm, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't want to pretend either," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a finality to the words, a silent vow that we both understood. Caleb's hand came to rest on my cheek, his thumb brushing gently across my skin as he held my gaze. "So, where does this leave us?" he asked, his voice laced with vulnerability. The question hung in the air, a quiet echo of everything we hadn't said, everything we still had to figure out. I could feel the weight of it, the uncertainty that lay ahead, but I also felt a calmness, a trust in whatever path this would lead us down. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding as I said the words. "But I think I want to find out." Caleb's smile was soft, a warmth that reached his eyes, and I could see the relief in his expression, a quiet gratitude that matched my own. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, a gesture that felt both tender and grounding, a quiet reassurance that we were in this together. We spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet companionship, talking about everything and nothing, sharing fragments of our lives, our dreams, our fears. It was like peeling back layers, uncovering pieces of ourselves that we hadn't shown anyone else, and with each revelation, I felt the connection between us deepen, a bond that felt as natural as breathing. As the sky outside began to darken, casting a soft glow over the room, Caleb finally stood, a reluctant smile on his face. "I should go," he said, though his hand lingered on mine, a silent promise in his touch. "But I'll see you again?" I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me at the certainty in his voice. "Yeah," I replied, my heart pounding as I looked up at him. "I'd like that." He pulled me into one last embrace, his arms wrapped around me in a way that felt both grounding and freeing, a quiet reminder of everything we had shared. And as he finally pulled back, giving me one last lingering look before he turned to leave, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. After he was gone, the apartment felt strangely empty, but I wasn't sad. I felt a quiet sense of peace, a warmth that lingered long after he had left. There was something beautiful in the uncertainty, in the quiet possibility that lay ahead. And as I sat there, a smile on my face, I knew that whatever came next, it was something I was ready to face.